following example. We have a convenient sample of students from Japan. This, I should say, is totally hypothetical. I don't know if this study's ever been conducted in any way. I just made this up. So a convenient sample of students from Japan. There's an experimental manipulation where half the students are assigned to a scarcity mindset condition that asks people to write about a time they did not have enough money, versus a neutral control condition, and then they measure prejudice towards poor people. And their prediction is that scarcity will increase prejudice. Right, so different, get a broader sample of people, whether it's like a broader sample of Japanese people or people from other countries, different kinds of experimental manipulations, right on. So there's different, what's important here, and this is a great highlight, is that when we're thinking about the generalizability of the study, we want to think about beyond just the generalizability of the sample, although that's what we often think about. Right, so we could have representative samples of the population from Japan, Canada, Germany, Argentina, Kenya, and India. We could have multiple experimental manipulations of scarcity, like an economic gain, but also this writing condition, and any others that we could think of. But then we could also measure prejudice towards multiple outgroups. Poor people is one outgroup or possible outgroup, but there's a lot of other ways other groups that could be included in that. So we tend to prioritize having findings that generalize. At least this is often the case in most of the work that I'm familiar with, because we want to have these answers to our research questions that we can apply to more than just the sample we're reflected the data from. And so oftentimes, this is just other people in the target population. So if we are typically studying students from this university, maybe we're like, okay, that's nice, but we'd like to say something about Indonesians broadly, and so then you try to get a representative sample of Indonesia, or people from Indonesia, or people from other cultural contexts. So there's like cross-cultural studies that try to do this, right? We look at Indonesia, and we can look at Australia, Malaysia, just picking countries that are nearby, Philippines, and so on, right? And we could see how, how these are similar or different across these cultural contexts. This is another common way. We're not doing any of that today. Not talking about this at all. All right. Because I think this is at least my experience is that we don't always talk about this, but this is often comes up. And there's a lot of work on this. Instead, what I'm going to be talking about is trying to think about how findings generalize across different kinds of stimuli. Whether this is experimental stimuli, so different kinds of experimental manipulations, or the stimuli used as dependent measures. And although most of my examples are the ones for the dependent measures, there's some papers that talk about the experimental side that are in the extra readings. So this here is an example from a really old paper from when I was 4 years old, and it's one of the first papers that I know of that talks about this issue of stimuli generalizability. They were studying this decision-making problem. It's a risky decision-making problem. Risky decision-making researchers love questions about people living on islands. I don't know why, but they do, and this is one of them. So you can choose. So either way, you have one person. Well, one person will definitely die in one. Out of your 100 population, or everybody has an equal chance of 1% of dying, which means, because I'm not expert on probability, I had to think what that meant. Well, what that means is that, like, on average, one person out of this 100 will die, but it's possible that 3 could die, or it's possible that 0 could die. So what Gideon and his colleagues point out, though, is that there's a difference here between the deep structure of the problem and what they call the surface structure of the problem. The deep structure is that there's this tension between doing nothing and doing something and having a sure option or an uncertain option. But there's all these other surface things that aren't really the thing that they care about. The study does not care about medical officers. They don't care about vaccine injections. They do not care about, they also have, this I forgot to mention. There's images depicting the choices in some of the study, but they never show the images in any of these papers, and they just describe them, which is the worst way for me to understand what an image looks like. So I don't know what they look like. But and then there's different ways, so they're not explicit about the probabilities in each scenario. So this idea that maybe 3% could actually die in the one, or 0 for something. But these are all surface structure things that you could make different choices on. If somebody else designed the study, they could have, it could be, instead of a medical officer, it could be a rogue citizen who wants to, inject people in their sleep, some weird person. So Gideon and his colleagues, they create another version. It reads a little bit differently, but the underlying structure is the same. So this one, it's still an island. They change some of the other details about who is doing the injections. And actually, they change a bunch of stuff. They also have this probability chart that they show some of their participants. So they have an exact replication of the prior study. On here, more than 50% of the people choose to inject, so they're risk averse. So this kind of people are risk averse. They have one where they don't use the image. It goes down a little bit. They also point out that these two differ from each other, so just like the medical officer and the islander one, this one here, people are risk averse. This one here, people are risk seeking. This is not something that changes the deep structure of the vignette, right? The underlying decision is the same. They're just changing what you call the roles, and it changes the results. So if people are risk averse or not depends on the surface features, not the deep structure, which means that original study might not tell us anything about risk-seeking behavior generally, but just in one specific domain. But there's still a lot of surface structure here. We have islanders going to the mainland, which is not irrelevant in the world, but is also one specific domain. We also have this disease infection, and there's medical intervention. Risk comes in other cases than just disease. And then also the sure decision is always taking action, as opposed to just waiting to see what happens.